We're not here to teach you, Admiral. We're here to beg. The year was 1942, and a British admiral sat across from his American counterpart in Washington, watching his own nation bleed to death one merchant ship at a time. His name was Sir Charles Little, 60 years old, a veteran of 2 wars, and he carried in his breast pocket a telegram that could end the Western Alliance before it truly began. Here's what most people don't know about the early days of America's entry into World War II. While Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the fight, the real battle was happening 3,000 miles away on the Atlantic coast. German submarines were hunting American supply ships in waters so close to shore that hotel guests could watch the tankers burn from their boardwalk balconies. The lights stayed on, the casinos kept running, and Britain was starving. This is the story of how one exhausted British officer had to break through American pride and convince a superpower to turn off its lights before his entire country collapsed into surrender. The clock was ticking, the U-boats were closing in, and Admiral Little was holding a secret that could destroy everything he was trying to save. Little stood on the dock as the winter sun set behind him, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The entire coastline blazed with light, neon signs advertising hotels and restaurants, street lamps lining the shore, car headlights streaming down coastal roads. It looked like peacetime. It looked like a carnival. And somewhere out there in the dark Atlantic, German submarine commanders were lining up their crosshairs against that brilliant backdrop. Commander Davis met him at the harbor office, a tall American officer with an easy smile that made Little want to punch him. Davis extended his hand and said the U-boat situation was under control, just a few isolated incidents, nothing the Navy couldn't handle with aggressive patrols. Little didn't shake his hand. Instead, he pulled a folder from his coat and dropped it on Davis's desk. The Daily Blacklist. 3 British-bound tankers sunk within 48 hours, all within sight of Cape Hatteras. 27 men confirmed dead, 62 missing, presumed drowned or burned. Davis glanced at the list and shrugged. "War is hell, Admiral. We're doing everything we can." Little stepped closer, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "You're doing nothing. Your coast is lit up like Christmas morning, and you're sending merchant ships out alone like sheep to slaughter. In Britain, we call this murder by negligence." Before Davis could respond, a young ensign burst through the door, his face pale. Another ship down, the SS Venor, torpedoed 12 miles off Virginia Beach. Oil fires visible from shore. Rescue boats were already pulling bodies from the water. Little walked past Davis without another word and headed toward the harbor. Through the window he could see the orange glow on the horizon where the Venor was burning. Behind it, the lights of Virginia Beach twinkled like nothing was wrong. He had 8 weeks to fix this. 8 weeks before the flour ran out in London. 8 weeks before Churchill's back-channel ceasefire talks became Britain's only option. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever heard this story before. These are the untold accounts of World War II that textbooks skip over, the desperate diplomacy and hidden sacrifices that shaped history. Your likes and comments help these forgotten stories reach the people who need to hear them. Now back to Admiral Little's impossible mission. The Navy Department building in Washington looked like a monument to American confidence. Marble floors, high ceilings, and officers who walked like they'd already won the war. Little's boots echoed down the corridor as a young lieutenant led him to Admiral Ernest King's office, past walls covered with maps of the Pacific Theater, Japanese positions marked in red. The Atlantic wasn't even on display. King didn't stand when Little entered. He sat behind his desk like a judge at a sentencing, gray-haired and granite-faced, with eyes that assessed Little the way a butcher might assess a cut of meat. The introduction was brief and cold. King had read Little's reports. He wasn't impressed. Little laid out the case he'd rehearsed 100 times. The convoy system had worked for Britain. Merchant ships traveling in protected groups, coordinated routes, air cover where possible. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the supply lines open. The U-boats couldn't pick off isolated targets anymore. The numbers proved it. King let him finish, then delivered his verdict with the finality of a vault door closing. Convoys were defensive tactics. They tied up destroyers that were desperately needed in the Pacific to fight Japan. The American Navy didn't win wars by playing defense. They would hunt the submarines, sink them at their source, take the fight to the enemy. That was how you won. Little felt something snap inside him. He leaned forward over King's desk and started talking about London, about his wife measuring flour by the spoonful, about British children with rickets because there wasn't enough milk, about the statistical reality that Britain had maybe 10 weeks of food left if the Atlantic supply line collapsed, 10 weeks before millions starved. King's expression didn't change. He stood slowly, walked to the wall map, and placed his hand flat on the Pacific Ocean. His voice was quiet but absolute. "We don't need lessons from a navy that let Singapore fall, Admiral. This is where we win the war." Little stared at the map of the Atlantic gathering dust in the corner. He realized then that he wasn't fighting German submarines. He was fighting American pride, and pride didn't care how many people died proving itself right. They came in at dawn like ghosts from another war. 24 British anti-submarine trawlers, rust-streaked and weather-beaten, limping into Norfolk Harbor after a brutal Atlantic crossing. These weren't the sleek destroyers the Americans imagined when they thought of the Royal Navy. These were converted fishing boats with welded gun mounts and depth charge racks, crewed by men who looked like they hadn't slept in months. Little stood on the dock and watched his countrymen tie up their vessels, and the weight of what he'd done settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. Every ship here was one less protecting the English Channel, one less guarding against a German invasion that could come any day. He'd stripped his homeland bare to defend a nation that didn't think it needed defending. The American sailors gathered along the pier didn't hide their contempt. Little heard the comments floating across the water. Rusty British garbage, barely seaworthy, the richest country on earth needing help from these floating wrecks. The laughter cut deeper than any of King's dismissals because it came from ignorance, not malice. Lieutenant Hayes found Little an hour later in the harbor office. He was young, maybe 25, with a kind of clean-cut earnestness that war hadn't beaten out of him yet. He'd been assigned to coordinate with the British crews, and he had questions, lots of questions. Hayes started formal and professional, asking about operational procedures and communication protocols, but as they talked, his composure began to crack. He admitted that his destroyer had been on 3 anti-submarine patrols and hadn't detected a single contact. They had sonar equipment, but nobody really knew how to use it effectively. They had depth charges, but no doctrine for when to drop them. The training manuals were thin and theoretical. Then Hayes asked the question that made Little realize not all Americans were blind. His voice dropped to something quieter, almost ashamed. "Admiral, can I ask you something honestly? How do you even find a submarine when it doesn't want to be found?" Little looked at this young officer, seeing in him the same fear he'd seen in British lieutenants 3 years ago when the war was new and terrifying. Hayes understood what his superiors refused to see. The U-boats weren't a problem you could solve with aggression and confidence. They were wolves in the dark, and you needed to know how to hunt them. Little handed Hayes a training manual, one written in British blood over 2 years of catastrophic losses. "You learn, Lieutenant, or you die trying." Little's boarding house room in Washington was barely larger than a ship's cabin, with thin walls and a radiator that clanked through the night. He sat at the small desk past midnight, reading letters from home under a single lamp. His wife's handwriting had gotten smaller, as if she was trying to conserve the paper itself. The grocer says perhaps 3 more weeks of flour. I've begun teaching Margaret how to make bread from potato peels. She thinks it's a grand adventure, bless her. I haven't told her what happens when the potatoes run out too. Little folded the letter and placed it back in his coat pocket, next to the Churchill telegram he carried everywhere. 3 weeks. The number haunted him more than any casualty report. The next morning he took a cab to Walter Reed Hospital to interview survivors from the SS Gulf America. The ship had been torpedoed off Jacksonville Beach 3 days earlier, close enough to shore that people on the beach had watched it happen. The Navy wanted Little's assessment of the attack for their records, as if he was an expert consultant on their own coastal disaster. The burn ward smelled of antiseptic and something worse underneath. The merchant captain from the Gulf America was wrapped in bandages from his chest to his fingertips, his face a patchwork of raw skin and gauze. His name was Peterson, and he'd been at sea for 20 years. Peterson told the story in a flat, distant voice. The torpedo hit at sunset. The oil ignited immediately. His crew abandoned ship in flames, swimming through burning water toward the beach. And on that beach, hundreds of people stood watching. Families on evening strolls, couples having dinner at seaside restaurants. They watched American sailors burn to death like it was a fireworks show, illuminated by the very lights that had made them visible to the U-boat in the first place. Peterson looked directly at Little with eyes that had seen something break in the world. "They could see us die, Admiral. The whole damn city watched us burn, and then they went back to their dinners." Little walked out of that hospital understanding something fundamental. The Americans weren't his enemy. They weren't even malicious. They were innocent in the most dangerous way possible. They didn't understand what war looked like because it hadn't reached them yet. Not really. Not in their bones. Anger wouldn't fix that. Only blood would. And Little was running out of time to find another way. The Germans called it Operation Drumbeat, and by late February it had become a symphony of destruction. U-boats were hunting in coordinated packs now, emboldened by the complete lack of resistance. They attacked within sight of New York Harbor, their periscopes cutting through water so close to shore that their commanders could see the Statue of Liberty silhouetted against the city lights. Little made a decision that could end his career. He went around King entirely and requested a meeting with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest aide and the man who actually ran much of the war effort from behind the scenes. It was a diplomatic grenade, the kind of move that could get him recalled to London in disgrace. Hopkins received him in a cramped West Wing office that smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. He was rail-thin and exhausted, fighting his own health battles while trying to coordinate a global war. He listened to Little's pitch for convoys with the attention of someone who understood the stakes but had no power to act. Hopkins explained the reality with brutal honesty. King ran the Navy like it was his personal kingdom. Roosevelt trusted him completely on naval matters. Any attempt to override King would create a command crisis that could cripple the entire war effort. Hopkins was sympathetic, genuinely so, but his hands were tied. The phone on Hopkins' desk rang while they were talking. He answered it, listened for a moment, and Little watched the color drain from his face. Another sinking. The SS Nornis, torpedoed off Long Island. That made 7 ships in one night, a record that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Little walked out of that hospital and went straight to the British Embassy to check for cables. There was one waiting, marked urgent from the Admiralty.
He read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. Statistical projection, supply collapse imminent, current loss rate unsustainable beyond 8 weeks, advised status of American cooperation. 8 weeks, not 10 anymore, 8. The math was simple and merciless. Every ship the Germans sank shortened Britain's timeline by days. Every day the Americans refused to act brought his country closer to starvation and surrender. Little walked to the window and looked out at the lights of Washington, bright and careless in the winter dark. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, another ship was probably burning, another crew was dying, and the clock kept ticking down to 0.
The news reached Little during breakfast at the boarding house. Lieutenant Hayes's destroyer, the USS Jacob Jones, had been torpedoed 60 miles off the New Jersey coast during what the Navy called an aggressive offensive patrol. A single U-boat had spotted the lone destroyer silhouetted against the coastal lights, fired 2 torpedoes, and disappeared into the dark. The Jacob Jones sank in less than an hour. 138 men went down with her. Hayes had been asking the right questions. He'd understood the danger, and the Navy had sent him out alone anyway, hunting shadows while the real wolves circled behind him. 2 days later, Little was summoned before a congressional committee investigating British influence on American military strategy. The hearing room was packed with hostile faces, senators who saw Little's warnings as an insult to American competence. They'd found a scapegoat for the mounting losses, and he was sitting right in front of them. Senator Brewster from Maine led the interrogation. He accused Little of spreading defeatist propaganda, of trying to dictate American naval policy, of undermining public confidence during wartime. The senator's voice rose with theatrical outrage as he suggested that British interference was doing more damage than German submarines. Little sat in silence and let them talk. He thought about Hayes asking him how to find a submarine. Hayes would never learn now. He thought about Peterson in the burn ward watching a city ignore his crew's death. He thought about his wife teaching their daughter to make bread from potato scraps. The committee wanted him to defend himself, to argue, to engage. He gave them nothing. What was the point? They'd already decided he was the problem. When he returned to the embassy that evening, another cable was waiting. The Admiralty's language had shifted from urgent to desperate. Supplies critical low, civilian rationing at emergency levels. Can you hold the line? Little read it 3 times and realized the terrible truth he'd been avoiding. He couldn't hold the line. He was losing. The Americans were too proud, too confident, too convinced of their own invincibility to listen. And while they argued about wounded pride and foreign interference, Britain was starving to death. He had maybe 6 weeks left. 6 weeks to accomplish what months of reports and meetings and desperate pleas had failed to achieve. 6 weeks before Churchill would have no choice but to open those back-channel ceasefire negotiations and abandon the war. Little sat down at his desk and began writing a cable he'd hoped he'd never have to send. King's office was dark when Little was escorted in at 10 at night. The American admiral sat behind his desk with a folder open in front of him, his face carved from stone in the lamplight. He didn't offer Little a seat. Naval intelligence had intercepted communications about a second British vessel transfer. Not trawlers this time, but destroyers, real warships, the kind Britain needed desperately to protect against a German cross-channel invasion. King had done the math, and the numbers didn't make sense unless Britain was planning to strip its home defenses completely bare. King's voice was quiet and dangerous. You've already pulled 24 ships from the English Channel. Now you want to send destroyers? What the hell are you hiding, Little?
Little felt the weight of the telegram in his breast pocket, the one he'd carried for weeks, the one he'd sworn he would never show to anyone. He reached inside his coat slowly, pulled out the crumpled paper, and placed it on King's desk. King read it once, then again. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. The telegram contained Churchill's coded authorization for back-channel ceasefire negotiations if the supply situation wasn't resolved by May. Not surrender exactly, but close enough. A conditional peace that would leave Britain alive, but effectively out of the war. King looked up at Little with new eyes. "You're telling me if we don't fix this, Britain is out of the war entirely?" Little felt something break inside him, the last remnant of professional pride that had kept him upright through months of dismissal and contempt. His voice came out raw and exhausted. "We're not here to teach you, Admiral. We're here to beg. Britain has 6 weeks of food left, maybe less. Every ship you lose is a ship that should have reached London. Every day you wait, more people starve. We've already stripped our own defenses to protect yours because we have no other choice." The room fell silent. King stared at the telegram like it was a death sentence, which in many ways it was. The professional disagreement had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of what failure actually meant. Not wounded pride or tactical debates, but the collapse of the entire Western alliance before the war had truly begun. King stood slowly and walked to his wall map of the Atlantic. For the first time since Little had met him, the American admiral looked uncertain. How much time do we actually have? Little's answer was simple and devastating. Not enough. General Order 242 went out on March 14, 1942. Mandatory convoy system for all coastal shipping. Total blackout of the eastern seaboard from Maine to Florida. No exceptions, no delays. Admiral King's signature was at the bottom, but Little knew what it had cost him to put it there. Little stood on the Norfolk docks 2 days later and watched the first convoy assemble. 15 American merchant ships arranged in protective formation, surrounded by a screen of destroyers and corvettes flying both the Stars and Stripes and the White Ensign. British and American crews working together, finally the way they should have been from the beginning. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, the lights went out. Not just in Norfolk, but up and down the entire coast. New York, Boston, Miami, every city and town that touched the Atlantic went dark for the first time since Pearl Harbor. The transformation was immediate and total. The shooting gallery closed. The neon graveyard went black. The convoy departed under cover of darkness, and Little watched from the harbor until the last ship disappeared beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there, the U-boats were still hunting, but now they were hunting blind, and their prey had teeth. 3 days later, the escort destroyers registered their first kill. Sonar contact, depth charge pattern, oil slick and debris confirming the destruction of U-85, the first German submarine sunk in American waters. It wouldn't be the last. The cable from London arrived that same afternoon. Little read it alone in his boarding house room, his hands shaking slightly. First flour shipment arrived intact, civilian rations stabilized. You held the line. Little sat at his desk and pulled out the Churchill telegram, the one with the coded ceasefire authorization. He held it over the ashtray and lit a match. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash, the contingency plan they'd never have to use. He walked back to the harbor that evening and stood watching the dark coastline. The daily blacklist would never be truly empty. More ships would sink, more men would die. The war was far from over. But for the first time in months, Admiral Sir Charles Little allowed himself to feel something close to hope. The arsenal of democracy had finally woken up, and the Atlantic lifeline would hold. The convoy system that Admiral Little fought so desperately to implement would go on to save countless lives and turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. By the end of 1942, U-boat losses began to exceed their ability to replace them, and the second happy time became a distant nightmare. But the cost of those early months was staggering. Between January and March 1942, over 200 ships were sunk along the American coast, most within sight of shore. This story matters because it reminds us that pride and institutional ego can be just as deadly as any enemy weapon. The young men who died on those burning tankers weren't casualties of German efficiency. They were casualties of American stubbornness and British desperation meeting at the worst possible moment. Many of you watching this may have had family members who served in the Merchant Marine or grandparents who remember the blackouts and rationing of World War II. These stories are part of your family history, part of the hidden sacrifice that kept the world free. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps push these untold accounts to people who would otherwise never know they existed. These veterans, British and American alike, deserve to have their stories remembered. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of World War II, and I'll see you in the next one.